CyberHub bunker and studio. You're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast. And now for your host and CISO, James Azar.
All right, world. Good morning. It's Tuesday, February 16th, 2021. Our practitioner brief is live. You can tune in and watch us live on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. Comment and subscribe if this is your first time tuning in. If you're listening on your favorite podcast listening platform after the fact, meaning you missed us live because you live in a time zone or you had a meeting or whatever it is, make sure to subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and join us Monday through Thursday, each and every single day, 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time here with the practitioner brief. A lot of things to talk about today, but before we get started on today's show, a shout out to our supporters, Know Before and Wistic. You can find them in the show notes below. Help support the sponsors that back our program. So before we get started, our ceremonial coffee sip. Return to my Master's Cup. I don't know. If you're a big golfer, give us a big like here. There's something very relaxing about golf as a cybersecurity professional. Just the quiet, the idea of just being out there, the strategy, a lot of really cool things. So let's get right into today's stories. We've got two really kind of important things to look at, and then we've got two others that are really just a really good heads up today. So let's start with what happened yesterday afternoon. The French came out and they essentially blamed Sandworm for hitting the French monitoring software vendor called Centreon. Centreon is an equivalent or a competitor of Solarwinds in France. It's essentially a French company based in France. And so this story gets more and more interesting. So the French National Agency for the Security and Information Systems, the INSSI, is now publicly blaming the notorious Sandworm APT group for a series of long-term, folks, highlight here, long-term hacking attacks against multiple IT and web hosting shops in Europe. According to a technical advisory release, the data breaches date back to 2017 and include the eyebrow-raising compromise of Centreon, an IT monitoring software provider that's widely embedded throughout government organizations in France and also in Europe. The agency did not say if the Centreon compromise was part of a supply chain attack, but the decision to publicly identify the Sandworm attackers triggers new conversations about how this group has been operating and so forth. We'll get to this in just a minute because this is really important. Here's the deal, though. Below in the comments, in the post itself, in the video, you'll see a link to this very report right here, which is essentially the Sandworm intrusion set campaign targeting Centreon systems. That's the description and the remediation from January 27 January of 21, folks. This is linked below. So if you're watching us on Facebook, YouTube, or LinkedIn, or if you're listening on your favorite podcast listening platform, the link is literally below. You should go and you should read this. It's a great read for one. Number two, it's reminiscent of an attack that we just talked about. We've been talking about for like 2 months. So very, very, very interesting. Something to keep an eye on. The risks here. If you're in Europe and you do use European networks, meaning you're diversifying, you don't use just one company in one spot. This is a really big one, and it's going to have some long-term impact on an organization, including from a cost perspective, not so much from a business operation perspective, but definitely from a cost and recovery perspective. This could have significant implications on an organization, and the sophistication of the attack, the longevity of the attack, all make this all the more concerning and all the more something we need to be paying attention to as we continue. North Korea is back. We had a little quiet from Kim Jong-un, but not so much. So a report according to South Korea now says, and this was reported by the AFP on Security Week, that North Korea tried to hack pharmaceutical giant Pfizer in an attempt to get information on the coronavirus vaccine and treatment technology. Pyongyang has long denied that they've got COVID in North Korea, being that North Koreans can only travel to China and COVID originated in China. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but nonetheless, a lot of people do rebuke the fact that there's no COVID in North Korea. In fact, some of the stuff that when I saw this story this morning and just speaking to some contacts I have in that part of the world, I was able to essentially identify the fact that there are cases of COVID in North Korea, that this is serious, and that the North Koreans are really trying to get their hands on a vaccine in order to be able to treat their general population, which is fine. Don't get me wrong. Like, we need to take care of that. There has to be a point where we go, all right, beyond that, beyond, the whole, conflict, we ought to take care of humans and save human lives. But with the sanctions and so forth, that hasn't been the case here. So both Pfizer and BioNTech said in December that documents relating to their vaccine were unlawfully accessed during a cyber attack on a server at the European Medicines Agency, where the stuff gets approved. So, folks, this stuff is really going to get more and more interesting as time goes by. Here's where the risk comes in, and I think a lot of folks look at this. If you work in an extremely regulated industry like biotech, pharmaceuticals, finance, fintech, and you're trying to get a regulatory approval, how do you audit the regulator you're supposed to be talking with? And that's a conversation we don't really have often, but we probably should start doing it, because a lot of these breaches aren't happening on the Pfizer network or on another pharmaceutical network. They're happening on government networks, meaning the people who are supposed to protect our IP, the people who were seeking approval in order to operate from, become the target of the attack once everything is submitted, because we invest time, we invest money in defending our networks. And on the other hand, the government short plays it and then gets breached. So something's got to give here. And unfortunately, this time it's not from the private sector, but rather the public sector. This is extremely disturbing. And that's how I saw this story today as I was reading it and kind of speaking to several colleagues over in Asia this morning. Definitely saw that be a thing. Let's talk about this next story here, thanks to ZDNet, where Microsoft says Solarwinds took more than 1,000 engineers to create. So Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, was on 60 Minutes over the weekend. If in case you missed that, you should probably go back and catch it. I felt like the interview was halfway decent. I'm not a fan of 60 Minutes as a general rule of thumb. The only 60 Minutes I like to watch is the one in Australia, because I feel like they do an impartial reporting. But nonetheless, he did bring up a few things about the sophistication. He goes, when we analyzed everything we saw at Microsoft, we asked ourselves how many engineers would have probably had to work on this, and the number they got to was certainly more than 1,000 in order to do the SolarWinds. I'm just going to make this a little bit larger for those watching. So among U.S. agencies confirmed to have been affected, obviously CISA, DHS, the State Department, Department of Energy. But here's something very interesting that he highlighted to 60 Minutes, that the attackers rewrote just 4,032 lines of code within Orion, which consists of millions of lines of code. So this is significant, because you understand that they really did study this. They found a way to plant code that wouldn't have been picked up, 4,000 lines in millions lines of code, and that's all it took to be able to take advantage of Orion and do so. There's a bunch of comments also here from me and Deanne and FireEye and a few more from Microsoft. I felt like this was really important. I mean, I'll be packaging this up to my board and to our CTO and our DevOps team in later updates that I'm going to be doing today and over the course of this week. I think this line is really significant. The fact is that they were able to watch and create a supply chain attack through code, writing only 4,000 lines of codes in millions, which is very difficult to audit 4,000 lines in millions, especially because they knew exactly where to put it in and use the write it in a very, very similar code to where it wasn't going to get picked up. It also didn't get picked up by any defending technologies like any EDR or antivirus technologies that are within that environment. And I think that's significant. So the conversations we need to be having now is along how do we avoid something like this happening? How do we identify a line of code out of millions of lines of code that could be malicious? How do we identify open source vulnerabilities or backdoors that are in open source code that could potentially make us victims of a supply chain attack? And that's very difficult to come up with the perfect answer. There's a bunch of different things we can do about that. And I'm sure we'll be having more conversations here in the next month and months to be had just around this very topic. And our final story of the day is scammers are targeting U.S. tax pros in an ongoing IRS phishing attack. This, according to our friends over at Bleeping Computer. So they're asking for the e-file identification, verification, and driver's license as part of a bogus verification process in order to create fraud. The IRS, on average, according to the FBI, loses around $300 million a year to IRS return tax fraud, which is significant because that's our taxpayer money. And instead of going to pay off our national deficit or support our infrastructure or our defense, it's money that goes to attackers, and we ought to do something better about it. Again, two stories today both highlight the challenges of government in securing its own infrastructure and securing itself so that taxpayers don't have to carry the brunt the brunt of fraud that goes on, because governments are just like, we'll just tax our citizens more. Instead of taking a little bit, and instead of addressing cybersecurity a little bit better within their own organizations, which I feel is significant. So you can see here the letters that people get. Also, they use the Tucson, Arizona address. The IRS says that tax professionals should be aware that this is a scam and should never, ever comply with this. You should probably share this, and they want you to report any emails or anything that you see around the IRS to phishing@irs.gov. That's it for our practitioner brief today, folks. We'll be back with a lot more tomorrow, including a new CISO Talk podcast launching tomorrow. So you'll want to tune in to that. We'll be back with more then. But tonight, Other Side of Cyber, 8:30 Eastern. If you're watching us in Asia, that's 12:30 Wednesday in Sydney with my co-host JJ. Tonight, we're going to be talking about human trafficking. 8:30 p.m. on the Other Side of Cyber, right here on your favorite social media network or your favorite podcast listening platform. Again, the Other Side of Cyber tonight with JJ at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. You'll want to definitely tune in to that. We do have a comment here, Nelson Mendez. Hackers posing for the IRS. How low could someone get? Hey, I mean, for a lot of people, the IRS is essentially a hacker all of within itself, right? Like, why should I have to pay, taxes for you guys to spend, $10 million on, $1.5 million on a lizard walking on a treadmill? That's what they do with taxpayer money here in America. So really, really stupid stuff. So I agree, Nelson. Thanks for the comment. But that's it for us here. 8:30 tonight, Other Side of Cyber. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. We'll be back here again, 9 a.m. Eastern with another practitioner brief and CISO Talk. So you'll want to tune in to that. Until then, guys, thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for tuning in. Stay healthy and stay cyber safe.
We love feedback, so make sure to connect with us on social media and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform.